Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. You know those horror movies where the babysitter is left alone in an old creaky house on Halloween night? Well, that was basically my life in 2017. Except I wasn't the cool, composed heroine. I was a 17-year-old high school junior with a talent for sarcasm and zero survival skills. I'd been roped into babysitting for the Hamiltons, a family with 3 kids under 10, at their farm on the outskirts of Madison, Wisconsin. Yeah, the extra cash was nice, but spending the spookiest night of the year in the middle of nowhere was not exactly my ideal plan. The farmhouse was everything you'd expect from a horror movie set. Wooden floors that complained with every step, dim lighting, not a neighbor in sight, and a backyard that faded into endless rows of cornfields. Even the carved pumpkins on the porch seemed to mock me as I stepped through the door. But the kids, Megan 6 years old and the twins Ryan and Max, 8, were thrilled. They'd already torn through most of their Halloween candy haul before I even arrived, and the sugar rush was in full force. "Can we watch a scary movie?" Ryan begged, his eyes shining with excitement. "No way," Megan whined. "Those are too scary." "How about we find something in between?" I suggested, flipping through the Hamiltons' modest DVD collection. We ended up choosing Coraline, not full-blown horror, but the creepy vibe fit the night perfectly. About 20 minutes later, the landline rang. The sharp sound made me jump. Who even uses landlines these days? Megan and the twins looked at me expectantly, and I sighed as I got up to answer it. Hanging on the kitchen wall was a battery-powered satellite phone, the kind lots of farms use for emergencies. The caller ID was blank. I picked it up, expecting a neighbor, or maybe the Hamiltons checking in to see how things were going. "Hello?" I said, pressing the old-fashioned handset to my ear. On the other end, silence, though I could hear a faint breathing. Prank call. Classic. "Very funny," I said with zero amusement. "Bye." I hung up and went back to the couch, brushing it off as some teen playing tricks. Not even 5 minutes had passed when it rang again. This time when I answered, a rough voice whispered, "I'm watching you." I laughed even though I didn't find it funny at all. "Nice try," I replied. "Happy Halloween to you too." I hung up hard, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. The kids noticed. "Who was it?" Megan asked. "Just someone playing a prank," I said with a forced smile that barely covered my discomfort. "Don't worry." We made it through almost the whole movie without any incidents, but just as the other mother was showing her true form, the screen flickered and went black. At first I thought the DVD had skipped, but then I realized the lights had gone out too. "Did the power go out?" Max asked, his voice trembling just enough to show how nervous he was. "Probably," I said, turning on my cell phone flashlight. "I'm going to check the breakers." The fuse box was in the basement. Cliché, I know. The stairs creaked under my weight as I went down, the air growing colder with each step. The shaky beam from my flashlight cut across dusty shelves and cobwebbed corners, but when I reached the panel, nothing looked out of place. All the switches were in the right position. That's when I heard it, a faint sound of footsteps directly above me. When I came back up to the main floor, the kids were huddled together on the couch, lit only by the cone of my flashlight. The landline rang again, slicing through the silence like a knife. "Don't answer it," Megan whispered, clutching a pillow. But I did. This time the voice on the other end said, "You shouldn't have gone downstairs." My blood ran cold. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. Click. The line went dead. I turned to the kids, trying to hold on to a shred of calm. "We're all going to stay in one room, okay? Someone's probably just trying to scare us." "Like a Halloween prank?" Ryan said. "Exactly," I lied. I slid the deadbolts shut on every door and window, double-checking them, and led the kids to the master bedroom. I told them it would be like an indoor camping trip and tried to make it sound fun, but the tension in the air was thick enough to chew. I jammed a chair under the doorknob for extra security and sat on the bed, phone in hand. I thought reading to them might help, but the books were all in the living room. I told them to stay in the bedroom, to lock the door as soon as I stepped out, and to only open it if they heard my voice. I went back downstairs, and that's when I noticed the muddy footprints. They started at the back door. I could have sworn I'd left it locked, continued through the kitchen, and disappeared down the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I traced them with the beam of my flashlight, each step pushing me closer to a terrifying conclusion. Someone had been inside. I called 911 and in a whisper, gave the operator all the details while the kids stayed hidden in the bedroom. The person on the phone assured me officers were on their way, but out there in the middle of nowhere. I knew it could take a while. Then I heard a low creak coming from the hallway. The light from my phone flickered as I aimed it toward the sound, but I didn't see anything. I ran back to the bedroom and locked the door again. The police are on their way, I told the kids, trying to sound convincing. We just have to stay quiet and wait. But the faint breathing just on the other side of the door told us we might not have that much time. The doorknob started to rattle, and the kids froze, eyes wide. I grabbed a lamp from the nightstand, ready to use it as a weapon. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. The rattling stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding in my ears. "Let's stay right here," I whispered to them, my mind racing to figure out who was out there and what they wanted. Suddenly, footsteps sounded in the next room, then the noise of drawers opening and closing. Whoever it was, they were searching through things. The kids pressed closer to me, eyes locked on mine. I motioned for them to stay completely silent, pressing a finger to my lips. The silence was so dense that my own heartbeat sounded deafening. No one moved, everyone listening to every creak. A crash made us all jump. Something, a vase, a picture frame, shattered against the floor. The noise came from the hallway right outside our door. I glanced at the chair wedged under the doorknob, silently praying it would hold. I only let myself breathe again when a distant wail began to rise, sirens getting closer. Then we heard hurried footsteps running away, fast, heavy thuds down the hallway, followed by the roar of a motorcycle engine. The sound grew louder, then faded into the night. Moments later, red and blue flashes lit up the windows, and a firm knock echoed through the front door. The police were there. I took the kids, and we stepped out of the bedroom on shaky legs, walking towards safety. The officers searched the house and the surrounding property. They didn't find the intruder, but they did find clear signs of forced entry. Muddy footprints leading from a living room window to the back door. Open drawers. Objects scattered all over the place. That night, as the kids and I went over every detail with the officers, I realized just how close we'd come to something much worse. Whoever it was had been inside the house, only a few steps away from us. The police called the kids' parents, who rushed back home, horrified when they heard what had happened. They apologized over and over, but I couldn't bring myself to stay the rest of the night. I drove home, and as the adrenaline faded, exhaustion and trembling took over. That night changed the way I saw the world. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. Fun and harmless scares. Now I'd learned to take every strange call, every unfamiliar noise seriously. And I learned that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones in movies or books. They're the ones standing right outside your door. Story 2. When I agreed to babysit for the Petersons at their country house near Nashville, Tennessee, I thought it would be an easy job. They only had one little one, a cheerful girl named Lily and a dog named Rufus, a huge protective German shepherd with soft brown eyes and a tail that moved like a metronome. As an animal lover, I was more excited about hanging out with Rufus than anything else. The house was rustic but beautiful, surrounded by tall trees that looked like something out of a painting. The crisp autumn air smelled like pine and damp leaves, and the sound of crickets filled the evening. Mrs. Peterson gave me a quick tour, pointing out the security system, the bedrooms, and Lily's bedtime routine. "Rufus will keep watch," she said, ruffling his fur. He's a great guard dog." I smiled and scratched him behind the ears. "I already feel safer." When the Petersons left, the house settled into a pleasant silence. Lily was a dream. She kept herself entertained with her favorite stuffed bunny and bedtime stories. By 8:30, she was tucked in and snoring softly. I settled on the couch to watch a movie, with Rufus stretched out at my feet. The living room was warm thanks to the crackling fireplace. Outside, the woods were pure darkness. That absolute black you only get far from city lights. As I sipped my tea, Rufus suddenly went on alert. His ears shot up and his body tensed. "What is it, big guy?" I asked. Rufus let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. I followed his gaze but didn't see anything, just the outline of trees swaying in the wind. "It's probably a raccoon," I said, more to myself than to him. But Rufus didn't relax. He stayed by the door, growling under his breath, his fur standing on end. The first hour passed without incident, but Rufus remained restless. Every now and then he would let out a growl or sudden bark, his eyes darting to the windows or toward the yard. I wanted to believe he was just being overly cautious, but a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. Then, while I was poking around the kitchen for a late-night snack, I noticed something odd. The glass of the sliding door had some smudges at a low height, as if someone had pressed their hands against it. I froze and leaned in to look more closely. They were faint, but they were there. And below the frame in the dirt outside, there were barely visible footprints. They were too big to belong to a child. My throat tightened as I backed away from the door. "It's fine. It was probably someone who was here earlier," I told myself. But Rufus's growl said otherwise. I locked the sliding door. Rufus followed me closely as I walked through the house, checking that every door and window was properly shut. By the time I sat back down, my nerves were shot and my tea had gone cold. That's when we heard a soft tapping. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the living room window. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned toward the sound, my pulse thudding in my ears. Rufus was already at the window, barking furiously, baring his teeth. His claws scraped the wooden floor as he tried to hurl himself at the glass. I couldn't see anything outside. The porch light only lit up a small patch near the front steps. I grabbed my phone and called Mrs. Peterson's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Then I called the police. The dispatcher assured me they would send someone to check the property, though it would take at least 20 minutes. "Great," I muttered, looking at Rufus. "We're on our own." The tapping stopped, but the tension inside the house was palpable. Rufus refused to move away from the window. His growls rumbled like a warning. I decided to go upstairs to check on Lily just to make sure she was still asleep. I crept up the stairs as quietly as I could and peeked into her room. She was fine, curled up under the blankets with her bunny. But as I turned to leave, I caught a flicker of movement through her window. The backyard. I walked closer, keeping the lights off so I wouldn't give myself away. There near the tree line was a shadow. It moved slowly, weaving between the trunks, until it stopped at the edge of the yard. The figure was tall and holding something that gleamed in its hand. A flashlight. A knife. I couldn't tell. I ran downstairs, my mind racing. Rufus was still by the window, barking louder than ever. I crouched beside him and whispered, "Okay, buddy, what's the plan?" As if he understood the signal, Rufus bolted toward the back door, barking fiercely. I followed, my heart pounding. Through the glass, I saw the figure approaching the house. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy wooden broom, and took my stance. Rufus was growling so fiercely that the sound echoed in the kitchen. The figure stopped. The hood hid any features. Rufus hurled himself at the door with such fury that he startled the intruder. They stumbled backward and their flashlight dropped to the ground with a clatter. Moments later, the wail of sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as a patrol car pulled up the driveway. Yes, all the way to the front of the drive. The intruder bolted toward the woods, vanishing into the darkness. I opened the door for the officers, my hands shaking. Rufus stayed at my side, still in full guard mode. The police searched the property but didn't find any trace of the intruder. The only thing they found was the flashlight he had dropped. Mrs. Peterson returned shortly after the police left. I told her everything, from Rufus's warnings to the shadow in the backyard. She hugged me tightly. "Rufus saved us," I said, scratching his ears. He wagged his tail, finally calm now that the danger had passed. I've always loved animals, but Rufus wasn't just a pet. He was a guardian, and I will always be grateful for his instincts. Locks and alarms are great, but nothing beats the intuition and loyalty of a four-legged friend. Story 3. I'd always been good with kids, probably why I'd wanted to be a teacher from the start. So when my mom's friend Mrs. Kelly asked if I could watch her 5-year-old son Charlie on a quiet spring afternoon in 2018, I said yes without a second thought. In a small town in upstate New York, her house was the very picture of warmth, the kind of home that feels like a hug. I walked in convinced it would be a piece of cake. I couldn't have been more wrong. Charlie was a quiet kid, but not in a shy way, more like he lived in his own little world. When I arrived, he was sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, carefully lining up toy cars in a perfect row. Mrs. Kelly gave me the usual instructions. Bedtime was at 8:30, snacks were in the fridge, and emergency numbers were taped to the refrigerator door. Easy, I thought. Lately, Charlie's been talking about his friend, she added with a little laugh. Just so you know, it's probably some imaginary buddy. He's very creative. That sounded fine to me. Imaginary friends are normal at his age. Honestly, it even sounded kind of adorable. After Mrs. Kelly left, I tried making conversation with Charlie, but he wasn't very talkative. He answered with one-word replies or nods, never taking his eyes off his toys. Eventually, I gave up and settled into the couch with a book. The house was peaceful, with distant birdsong and golden evening light spilling through the windows. It wasn't until Charlie started whispering that I looked up. At first, I thought he was humming or babbling nonsense, but then I caught a few words. "Yes, Grandpa. I'll show her." "Who are you talking to, buddy?" I asked, setting my book aside. He looked at me very seriously. "With Grandpa." "Oh," I smiled. "Is Grandpa your friend?" Charlie shook his head. "He's my real Grandpa. He comes to visit me." That threw me off. I knew enough about the Kellys to know that Charlie's grandparents were gone. They had died years ago. Maybe he'd heard stories about them and built some imagined version in his mind. "What is Grandpa like?" I asked, curious. "He stands by the tree in the yard," Charlie said casually. "He has a watch that goes tick-tick-tick, and he rocks in his chair." The way he described him was so specific, so vivid, that a chill ran through me. I glanced out toward the yard, but all I could see were the bare branches of the big tree swaying in the breeze. As the afternoon went on, I just couldn't shake the strange feeling his words had left me with. He wasn't the kind of kid who made up elaborate stories, and the details about the watch and the rocking chair felt uncomfortably personal. After dinner, we played with blocks in the living room. Charlie kept looking over at the sliding glass doors that led to the yard. I asked if he wanted to go outside and play, but he quickly shook his head. "He doesn't like me to go out," he said quietly. "Who doesn't like it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Grandpa." I tried to brush it off, but there was a weight in his voice that made my chest tighten. "And why doesn't he like it?" Charlie shrugged. "He says it's not safe." By the time I tucked him in, the unease had settled deep in my stomach. The house was quiet. So quiet, it felt like the silence was pressing against my ears. I stayed in the living room, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, trying not to think too much about Charlie's grandpa. Then I heard a soft creak, like wood complaining under pressure. My eyes snapped to the sliding glass doors. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow by the tree. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was just the wind. It was spring, the branches moved, the shadows moved. There was nothing out there. Still, I slid the lock into place just in case. As I was putting toys away, I noticed something odd on the mantel above the fireplace. An old picture frame. Curiosity got the better of me and I picked it up. It was a black and white photo of a man sitting in a rocking chair under a tree. His face was kind but weathered, and on his wrist he wore a large-faced watch. I set the frame down quickly, my pulse racing. It had to be Charlie's grandfather. But how could Charlie describe him so precisely if he'd never met him? Had he seen this photo? Maybe Mrs. Kelly had told him stories about her father, and yet the exactness of the details still felt deeply unsettling. Later, lying on the couch with a blanket over my legs, I heard something that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. A child's voice. "Grandpa, why are you sad?" My heart clenched. The voice was coming from Charlie's room. I grabbed my phone and crept down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet. I stopped outside his door. "I miss you too," Charlie whispered, but she doesn't believe me. I pushed the door open. Charlie was sitting up in bed, and he jumped when he saw me. "Who were you talking to?" I asked. "With Grandpa," he answered in a whisper. "There's no one here, Charlie," I said gently. "It's just us." He pointed to the window. He was standing right there. The next morning, Mrs. Kelly came home. Her usual cheerfulness felt out of place after such a strange night. As I helped her bring in the groceries, I took a moment before asking, "Can I ask you something about Charlie?" "Of course," she said, setting a bag of apples on the counter. "He's been talking about his grandpa. He says he sees him by the tree in the yard. Is that normal?" Mrs. Kelly went rigid. Her smile disappeared. I told her everything. Charlie's descriptions, the conversations, the photo on the mantel. As I spoke, her face grew paler and paler. "My father passed away a few weeks ago," she said at last, in a low voice. "Charlie doesn't know. We didn't want to upset him." A chill ran right through me. But he described him perfectly. The watch, the rocking chair. Mrs. Kelly nodded, her trembling hands gripping the edge of the counter. Those were his favorite things. He would sit under that tree for hours, rocking and fiddling with that old watch. I didn't know what to say. Was Charlie really seeing his grandfather's spirit? Or was this his way of processing a loss he didn't fully understand? On the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the photo and the way Charlie had spoken into empty air with such conviction. I'd always considered myself a rational person, but that night left me questioning everything. Even now, when I think about that cozy little house and the tree in the backyard, I wonder, was Charlie just a creative child with a vivid imagination? Or was there something, or someone watching over him, trying to build one last bridge? Whatever the truth is, I learned that some things slip beyond any explanation, and sometimes you don't need to understand them to know they're real. Story 4. I took that babysitting job because, as a broke first-year college student and aspiring journalist, I desperately needed the money. It was a simple assignment. Watch a 6-year-old girl named Mia for a few hours, while her mother, a nurse, worked the night shift at the hospital. The apartment was in an old neighborhood in New Orleans, Louisiana, the kind where the air always feels thick with humidity, and the streets have a lived-in charm. It was a sticky summer evening in 2016, and the sun had just set. The pale yellow streetlights washed over the sidewalks. The apartment was cozy, not very big, but neat and inviting. Mrs. Ellis, Mia's mom, gave me the usual rundown. Emergency contacts, bedtime routine, and a list of approved snacks. Mia was shy but sweet, and within an hour we'd already bonded over her collection of picture books. Mia had just fallen asleep when I noticed it for the first time. The living room had a large window facing the street, framed by thin floral curtains. From the couch I could see everything outside, parked cars, streetlights, and the occasional pedestrian. At first he looked like just another passerby, a tall man in a gray hoodie standing by a street lamp a few yards from the building. I wouldn't have paid him any mind, except for the fact that he didn't move. His face was hidden by the shadow of the hood, but I could feel his eyes fixed on the apartment, specifically on the window where I sat. I told myself he was probably waiting for someone, or taking a break, but there was something about his stillness, so rigid that made my skin crawl. I pulled the curtain shut and went back to my book, though my concentration was already shattered. An hour passed and the man was still there. I peeked through a sliver in the curtain, hoping he'd left. But no. He was now leaning against the pole, hood still up. The street was nearly empty, and his presence felt increasingly out of place. I almost called Mrs. Ellis, but held back. I didn't want to seem paranoid. Instead, I told myself to check the locks and peek into Mia's room to make sure she was still sound asleep. As I moved around the apartment, I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling of being watched, even with the curtains closed. By 10 p.m., the man had disappeared, or so I thought. I was in the kitchen rinsing a bowl when I heard it. A knock. Not from the front door, from the living room window. Every muscle in my body tightened as I walked toward the sound. The curtains were still drawn, but the tapping came again. Hello? Nothing. I slid the curtain open barely an inch, and my breath caught. He was right there on the other side of the glass, only inches away. Hood still up, face mostly in shadow, but I could make out the shape of his jaw and the faint glint of his eyes. I dropped the curtain and stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher's steady voice sounded almost unreal compared to my panic. "There's a man outside the apartment," I whispered, afraid he'd hear me. "He's been watching for hours and now he's knocking on the window." The dispatcher assured me a patrol was being sent and told me to stay inside and lock all doors. I stayed in the living room listening for any sound Mia might make, ready to run to her if I needed to. I'd already checked the locks and pulled the curtains tight when I heard it. Soft at first, then unmistakable. The subtle jiggling of the doorknob. My blood froze. I stared at the door, trying to convince myself it was the wind or a loose hinge, but it came again. Intentional. Testing. The man was trying to get inside. Panic surged, but I stayed quiet. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a decorative vase from the shelf, and positioned myself between the door and the hallway leading to Mia's room. My hands trembled, but I gripped the vase tightly, eyes never leaving the entrance. The jiggling stopped. For a second, I dared to think he'd given up. Then I heard footsteps outside, moving along the side of the building. He was circling, looking for another way in. I barely breathed as I counted his steps. The curtains were closed, but those thin sheets of fabric felt useless. My mind ran through every scenario, every escape route. Time was the only thing between him and us. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. A sickening silence filled the air. A sharp tap against the window shattered it. I turned slowly toward the sound, my stomach twisting into a knot. A shadow moved behind the curtain, barely visible under the dim glow of the streetlight. He was there, inches away, separated from me only by glass and fabric. I couldn't see his face, but I didn't need to. The way he stood, the deliberate pause. It was clear this wasn't random. He was waiting, watching, savoring my fear. I wanted to scream or call someone, but I couldn't risk waking Mia. She was just steps away, asleep in her little bed, unaware of the danger I had to protect her. Then, far away, I heard it, the faint rise of sirens. He must have heard it too, because his shadow shifted, and just like that, he slipped into the night. I didn't move until the red and blue flashes lit the room. A knock on the door made me jump, but when I looked through the peephole, I saw 2 uniformed officers. "He's gone," I whispered after opening the door, my voice thin and shaky. He tried to get in and then moved around to the windows. They inspected the apartment as I recounted everything. Outside, they found footprints near the window and faint scratch marks on the door. "We'll keep an eye on the area," one officer said, trying to reassure me, but his words felt hollow. The man was gone, and with him, any chance of answers. When Mrs. Ellis returned, I told her every detail I could remember. She hugged Mia tightly and promised she'd install security cameras the very next day. She apologized over and over, but I knew it wasn't her fault. Still, I never babysat for her again. I couldn't go back to that apartment after that night. Years later, I still can't shake the memory. I catch myself staring at windows, checking locks more than once, scanning the street for anyone lingering too long. The truth is, the most terrifying monsters don't hide under the bed. They stand outside, silent in the shadows, waiting for you to see them. And once you do, you never forget. If these babysitting nightmares gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with your bravest friends. Do you have your own terrifying babysitting story? Drop it in the comments or send it to me. I'd love to feature it. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you're the first to catch our next spine-chilling episode. And remember, babysitting isn't just about watching the kids. It's about watching your back. Stay safe, thanks for watching, and see you in the next nightmare.